Sidney Crosby reaches another milestone as the Pittsburgh Penguins get back on track. The Winnipeg Jets have a 3-game winning streak, and the Detroit Red Wings have their first 2 games under their new coach and a milestone for Patrick Kane. We've got all this and a lot more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they drop. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show a very familiar face and voice to Locked On NHL viewers and listeners, Hunter Hodies of Locked On Penguins. And, well, let's start with this. Sidney Crosby just keeps racking up the milestones. He passes Mario Lemieux to become the all-time assist leader in Penguins history. What does this mean for Sidney Crosby, and is it more special because it's Mario Lemieux he passed?
It's definitely a bit more special, obviously, because Mario is the greatest player in this franchise's history. I still have him up there. Sid, he's still number 2. If you want to say 1B, you can put him there as well. But I have Mario still a little bit above Sid. But again, that's just my personal opinion. But, you think coming into the league, Sid, he's the next one. He's the next one, right? And you think, man, it would be awesome if not only he lives up to the hype, but he breaks all of Mario's records. Well, there's one right there that he just broke. All-time assist leader. Points is next, Gil. I think he's going to get that before he retires. And then goals as well. I think he's also going to get that record before he retires as well. That one I think is going to be maybe a bit harder of the two, but I still think he's going to get it before he retires. But seeing him break a record like that, I think one that basically everyone for at least a long time felt was never going to be broken. Again, it really is surreal. And it came right from Sid's office below the net. He threaded that pass beautifully right to Michael Bunting. He puts it in the back of the net, makes no mistake with it. Just a vintage Sidney Crosby play. And he was great all game tonight. He's been really good these last several weeks. One of the biggest reasons, in my opinion, why the Penguins have really climbed back into this race and why right now they actually are in the final playoff spot in the Eastern Conference, but the Ottawa Senators do have a few games in hand.
What has been different about Crosby over these last few weeks? Because he really has come on. Not that he was playing poorly before, but now he's Sid again, it almost feels like.
Yeah, he had a bit of a slow start to the season, looked kind of lethargic, which I really never have said about him considering the way that he has played throughout his entire career. But I think, he was a bit lethargic. The entire team, honestly, was a bit lethargic. But then ever since it feels like for me, that game against Vancouver, he's been on fire and the rest of the team has also been on fire as well. They're 10-4-1 during that stretch. They have an opportunity to finish the month or the stretch, 11-4-1 heading into the new year. He's been great below the dots. His defensive game has improved. He's shooting the puck a bit more. I want him to continue to be a bit more selfish, but he is playing like the Sidney Crosby we all know and love. He's also chasing the point per game record this year, by the way, which is also pretty big. He's still above a point per game right now. So I think just his overall game has been so much better. Again, ever since that game against Vancouver and the rest of the team saw him play like that, and they're like, okay, it's go time, honestly. I'm trying to think of a better way to describe it, but I think that's honestly the best way to describe it.
And that game was right around American Thanksgiving?
Yeah, they always have their annual pre-Thanksgiving Eve game. Great crowd, by the way, in Pittsburgh. A lot of times it is against the Canucks. It was against the Canucks again this year, and he was great in that game. So was Erik Karlsson. So was Evgeny Malkin, Chris Letang. And ever since then, again, they have been lights out for the most part.
And, you mentioned Crosby coming on. Obviously, one issue that the Penguins have always had in recent years is goaltending. How has the goaltending contributed to this recent run of success?
Yeah, I think both have been a bit better. Obviously, Alex Nedeljkovic, at least in this start against the Islanders, I feel like that was one of his better starts, if not his best start of the year. I'm not really going to pin both of those goals on him that he allowed. One really bad balance, another one was a deflection, but he was making timely save after timely save, something the Penguins really haven't had a lot of from either netminder this year. Honestly, the goalie that's made most of the timely saves, Joel Blomqvist, he's down in Wilkes-Barre right now, and we're not sure if we're going to see him, for the rest of the season, though. It could happen if one of the goalies gets traded at the deadline. We'll have to see, but he's going to be up here full-time, I think, at some point. But he's at least been a bit better these last couple of starts. And for Tristan Jarry, obviously he had a really poor start to the season, goes down to Wilkes-Barre, tries to figure out his game a little bit more. Since then, again, the bar has very much been on the floor. He's been better, but I still need him to play at an even higher level if this team wants to try and make some noise and continue pushing for that final playoff spot in the Eastern Conference. He's, again, playing a bit better, but I feel like if he can get to a little bit above average, that type of spot, I think they'll be in decent shape heading into 2025 here.
One other thing that the Penguins have benefited from this recent streak, and also really all year, is special teams. Yeah. We saw it again on Sunday. 2 power play goals against the 32nd ranked Islanders penalty kill, but still 2 for 2 on the power play. Talk to me about the importance of special teams for the Penguins this year.
Yeah, they've scored on 6 of their last 9 power play opportunities. They are red hot right now on the power play, top 10 unit in the league. I can't even believe I'm saying that to you after how bad they were last year. At the bottom of the league in terms of power play, look where they are a year later, top 10. And it goes to show, they had this type of power play last year, they would have made the playoffs by a pretty significant cushion, if you're asking me, with how that unit really dragged them down last year. But it's so much more fluid. They're so much more methodical. They're actually zipping the puck around with authority. The zone entries are so much better. They have that shoot first mentality. They're getting traffic to the net. Everything about the power play this year, all those elements, it's all working. They didn't do any of that last year under Todd Reirden. Again, it was arguably the biggest reason why they didn't make the playoffs, but they have fixed all of those units for the power play, and it's clicking on all cylinders. In the PK, I know they didn't face the greatest power play in the league, Gil, because the Islanders also have the 32nd ranked power play heading into this game, but they've also killed off 21 of the last 22 on the penalty kill. Special teams have been a big factor for the turnaround in the last 5 weeks.
So we're approaching the halfway mark of the season, calendar about to turn to 2025. Where do the Penguins stand now? What are they looking to do to try to nail down one of those last playoff spots in the East?
It's really just staying consistent. You've had a really nice run here for the last 5 weeks, before that Thanksgiving game against the Canucks. You got to just stay with it. You got to keep playing simple. You got to keep getting the depth scoring. The goaltending has to be there. The special teams have to be there. You're going to get the production from Crosby. Carlson has been mostly very good outside of that game on Saturday against the Islanders in the first half of the home and home. But you got to really just keep doing what you have been doing for the last 5 weeks. Obviously, the games in hand, not your friend. A lot of these teams in front of them, they have games in hand on the Penguins. So you can't go back and replay some of those games that you got blown out in, but you can at least continue to make things interesting if you really are able to bank points heading into 25 and just keep the pressure on. I don't think they're going to be too aggressive at the trade deadline. They're not in a situation to do that. I don't think you're going to see them, trading out picks or rentals or being a super aggressive buyer, like, maybe like a team like the Panthers. I still expect them to sell some assets at the deadline, including someone like Drew O'Connor, someone like Marcus Pettersson. But I still feel like if they are right around in that race, it's going to maybe make those decisions a bit more difficult, but I would still do it because I know they have their eye on the long-term future. But again, Gil, they got to really just keep plugging away, keep banking points when you can. And, I guess the rest of it will take care of itself.
Do you think they'll look to add anything? Some depth player, a depth defenseman, a depth forward?
I could see them maybe adding a depth player if that fits. I also think this could be for a summer move. If they, for example, do move Marcus Pettersson, which I do think they will, and they potentially get a late first back for him because I think he's probably going to be the best rental defenseman at the deadline. And there's always a GM out there that's willing to trade you a late first. I can see them maybe, with that extra first, maybe packaging that to go get a younger player who can be here for, the next 3 to 4 or 5 years and be the next part of that contending team. Again, that's something well in the future, but I think if they add, it's probably going to be something really small. You're not going to see them trade out a bunch of, first, seconds to go get the big fishes or anything like that, and rightfully so.
Makes sense. Absolutely. Hunter, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you and your co-host on social media?
Yeah, you can find the Locked On Penguins podcast wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, etc. You can follow me on Twitter at Hunter Hodies. You can follow my co-host, Patrick Damp, on all social media platforms at Synonym for Wet. And we will have a new episode for you all on Monday to break down these 2 games against the Islanders and get you all set for the Penguins' final game of 2024 in Detroit against the Red Wings.
All right, Hunter, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Gil.
Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? Well, that definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's premium features. For me, one of the best features is the subscription tracker. I've used it to cancel services I wasn't using anymore, and I've already saved a ton. So cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon. It is great to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, Harrison Lee. And Harrison, the Jets back on track, a 3-game winning streak. What was the difference now? What has been working so well over the last few games and really over the whole season, if you look at the big picture?
Well, for one thing, they're finally at home. That 10 or 11 game road trip was just completely brutal. I feel like the NHL schedule makers were a little cruel with that one. They had one of the hardest stretches, I think, of any team in the league. And, given where all of these teams were geographically, it was a lot. And then, of course, they lose, their most important defender outside of Morrissey and Sandberg. And, the rest was kind of like domino effects. It all sort of fell apart. Ehlers then goes down for a couple of games. So they've dealt with some serious adversity, but things are starting to calm down a little bit. Finally the Jets power play is now back to full strength with Ehlers back in tow. He's been a huge difference maker there. So it's good to see him back, but I think it's just, not as much travel, a little calmer. And I think the next 10 odd games or so, the Jets are going to be in Winnipeg, which is nice. A little strange. I don't quite understand what the schedule makers were up to, but okay. I don't know if it's because of the Four Nations stuff or what, but man, some of the odd scheduling for the Jets this year in particular, compared to a lot of other teams, I just, if there's one thing I can quibble with already, it's probably that. But Winnipeg has managed to stabilize. Hellebuyck is still Hellebuyck, so you never have to worry about that. But it is nice to see the 5v5 offense the past couple of games actually starting to do stuff again. For a little bit, it was definitely muted, but seems like they have at least started putting 2 and 2 back together.
The Jets are first in the league right now in goals scored, and everybody's talking Kyle Connor, Mark Scheifele, Josh Morrissey for his setting people up. Give me the names of a couple of guys who maybe people who don't follow the Jets every day have really been contributing but aren't making a lot of headlines.
I think one of the biggest guys that probably falls on this list is Adam Lowry. Although Jets fans will certainly love him, Lowry is kind of like their bulldozer. I think sometimes they actually lean a little too heavily on him. He's obviously very good at what he does, basically caving in depth players and bottom lines. But I think the Jets have really asked him to be like this versatile, do-it-all, forechecking beast line this year. And I'd say the past couple of weeks it's been a little more mixed, but, towards the start of the season, they were crushing their minutes. And, really it was this team's constructions is super funny because like you've got a Jets top line that's kind of mediocre by some top line standards, and then you've got the Lowry line that's like the best third line in hockey, but they're basically playing like a second line role. So Winnipeg is just a very upside down kind of team, but I think Lowry's probably been one of the really big catalysts. Neil Pionk also very funny. He has been a huge portion of this team's offense. It's definitely not been the same without Sandberg. With Sandberg, the Jets have like one of the best, I would say, overall second pairings around. But without Sandberg, he has been a nightmare. So really important to have Dylan back, and that pairing has been really, honestly, better than the Morrissey pairing. I know a lot of people see the points for Morrissey and stuff, and they're like, oh, that's clearly your number one. And it's like, well, Dylan DeMello's kind of taken a step back this year. So without that, I think it's really come down to Sandberg and Pionk being one of the D pairings that I actually trust the most. I do know that there's going to be some mishaps, and we know that Neil sometimes defensively he misses some reads and assignments, but the offense that he has where he just sort of becomes your fourth forward out there, that's been a really big blessing and something that's been very helpful for the Jets. It does probably mean they're going to re-sign him long-term, so that's a little concerning, but we'll have to just wait and see on that one at least.
The power play is elite at the top of the league right now, but the penalty kill a little below average, 20th right now. What has to happen for that to improve? What are they not doing well?
Really weird because the PK at the start of the year was much better. They've really backed off the pressure a lot. It feels like they're a little reticent to go after puck carriers and pressure guys more towards their own blue line. And so they sort of like drop deeper, shell up, and they get really close in front of Hellebuyck. And that just ends up being a nightmare because then there's too many passing seams. And I feel like it was an adjustment to try and compensate maybe for some of the lack of personnel. But I think with Winnipeg, the more that you back off pressure, the worse that things get. And that's definitely true for the PK. Like I said earlier, this year, it really was pretty decent. It was at least like league average. And honestly, even now at 20th, it's not as bad as it was. But it's definitely been leakier the past couple of weeks. And if they don't get the pressure back, I think that's going to be a really big problem. It's why they were bottom of the league the last couple of years. Would really appreciate if it's not even just middle of the pack would be a huge boost for this team, especially in the back half of the season. So hopefully that turns around quickly, but we'll have to have a few guys healthier before then, I would imagine.
We are approaching the midway point of the season, calendar about to flip to 2025. As we get closer to the second half, what do you think the Jets will look to do to fine-tune this team and get ready for the playoff stretch drive?
I think they'll want two things, and I think that they'll only be able to really afford one of them. They'll have to probably make a compromise on the second part, but their primary want is going to be a 2C. Lambert's not really ready for it. I love Brad. He's very fun, and I think in the latter games that he played with Winnipeg earlier this year, he did start to show some real growth. But in terms of what the Jets really need out of that line, especially alongside Ehlers and Perfetti, you probably need a proven option. I know we were joking a little bit before the show about Brock Nelson maybe being a really big target. I think he's like the ideal kind of center the Jets are after. Big body, big net front presence. Also just skates. Like he can actually skate. For a 6'4" dude, he's pretty swift. Winnipeg doesn't have a lot of foot speed, and that's kind of been one of the things that you get to the playoffs and it shows up in a big way. So if they can find somebody who's not, sluggish and who can also contribute offensively, which knock on wood is very Brock Nelson-y, I think that's going to be a big thing. Their second want is going to be a right-sided top four defender or maybe a lefty, one of those two. And I just don't know if they're going to have the assets to try and make a big play. I don't know how big they're going to be chasing here. I think that they've seen with the injury crisis, Logan Stanley is playing with Pionk at times. Colin Miller's on his offside right now. You just have a whole mess of things. And like the moment that Sandberg went down, kind of the whole defense fell apart. So the Jets definitely have a really big personnel need. I think DeMello himself not being at his best has been a little bit of a surprise. He just started his extension, but he's really not been the same guy that he was the last few years. And I don't know if it's an injury, if it's age catching up, but if that's the case, the Jets have a huge, huge hole on the right side. So Rasmus Anderson, I think, would be a very interesting target. They're not going to go for that unless they like absolutely find some home run kind of deal. But I don't see that materializing. So they could try for like, I saw an article from I think the Free Press or something for Winnipeg talking about Alexiak and Ristolainen. Not options that I'd really be after. Alexiak's pretty solid. I'd be okay with that. But we're talking Ristolainen or David Savard. I think you'd just be better served leaning on one of your internal guys. But we all know the Jets have made some interesting trades the last few years. So as long as it's cheap, I suppose it couldn't be too bad, but we'll just have to see. But I would love if they can at least find an upgrade for either the third or the second pairing.
There's been a little talk about attendance. Is it a major concern right now for this organization? And if so, what can they do about it?
I mean, it's a concern in the sense that they are trying to address it. What I think tends to get missed is it's all corporate sales. That's really the problem. The Jets were kind of, I don't want to say arrogant, but they definitely, I think, took things a little for granted for the first 10 years or so and didn't really target corporate sponsors as much. Past couple of years, they've definitely said it's a problem. This year, I think they're making a really concerted effort to try and fix it. And they've definitely seen some growth. We've had a couple more sellouts this year than we did last year. So that's a positive step, but it does take time. I mean, business relationships, especially from a business community that I think feels a little bit spurned by True North, those bridges probably will take a little time to heal. But I think in the long run, you'll see that stuff kind of iron out. The Jets, relatively speaking, are still in many ways a nascent organization. Although I think now that the honeymoon period is over, they really need to update and modernize in some areas. But they're cognizant, they're trying to fix it, and I think that's probably the most important part. Making that first step and then going from there.
All right, Harrison, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
They can find me at HL Living Loco and LO_Winnipeg Jets on X/Twitter. And we are at Locked On Winnipeg Jets on all of the same podcasting platforms that Locked On NHL is.
All right, Harrison, thanks so much.
Thank you.
It is great to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Red Wings, Brian Fisher. And Brian, not a dull moment around Detroit these days. Last week, Todd McClellan in as the new head coach. They start him off with games against Toronto and Washington. Certainly no easy task. What was your first impression of any difference that McClellan made in the first two games?
Well, the first thing I want to do, Gil, is take that game against Toronto and throw it out the window. Because Todd McClellan quite literally started his job on that Friday. He had his press conference. They did a morning skate. He said in the press conference, I can't wave a magic wand and fix everything. Like, the goal tonight is to go play hockey. It'll be a similar lineup. They'll be playing the system they've been playing because I can't implement a new system in a 45-minute practice. So I just want to see what this team has. I just asked them to go out there with energy, play hard, play smart. And then they lost 5-2. The underlying numbers looked fine in that game, but they got exposed hard by a much more talented team, and they looked a little bit lost at times. So I look at Sunday as the true first game of the McClellan era, the game against the Washington Capitals and the second of a back-to-back, also ironically having played the first half against Toronto. All three of those teams played against each other this weekend, and they dominated that hockey game, and that was very reassuring. I mean, obviously, we're all aware of the new coach bump that seems to happen, but I do feel very encouraged by a lot of things that McClellan has said leading up to this game. It's kind of become the new slogan for the team on Saturday during their practice, and nearly, if not a little over an hour-long practice, which for an NHL team is actually quite a long time. NHL teams don't spend a lot of time on the ice during their actual practices. Their practices come in the gym, during video training. The actual on-ice stuff doesn't typically take that long. He bag skated them, and one thing that he said that all the beat writers heard when he was on the ice was, play effing hockey. You've done it your whole lives. And I tell you, that sent shockwaves through Red Wings social media, because that was the kind of fire that Red Wings fans had been lacking with Derek Lalonde. Then, to Derek Lalonde's credit, there is I was a big supporter of him. I was a big proponent. I loved, in theory, the things that he had to say. But after a while, when it doesn't work, that message grows stale. And the game against the St. Louis Blues before Christmas, everyone was in agreement it was time. The team looked like they did not want to play hockey anymore, and they were in front of a home crowd and got booed off the ice. Everyone was like, okay, now you can no longer put it off. Scotty and I have been saying it since Thanksgiving, and I have friends who have been saying it since the offseason. But it boiled to a point where it's like, okay, you can no longer ignore this. And they didn't. They brought in McClellan, and his energy, his fire immediately struck a chord. And the play effing hockey, coupled with him talking about in his post-game press conference after the Maple Leafs loss, where he's talking about the team felt too robotic. And his message during the introductory press conference when he said, you can't bring a system to a team and have them play it. You have to play a system that worked with the team. Resonated as well, because a lot of the criticism Lalonde had taken was that he was trying to get a team that was offensive oriented with Patrick Kane, Alex DeBrincat, Lucas Raymond, Dylan Larkin, trying to get those guys to play a defense first system. And defensively, they were actually okay, but what it did was it completely stifled any offensive creativity. They were told to play a system strictly by that system. And McClellan said, no. Go out there and play hockey. And the game against the Washington Capitals, they dominated more than I've seen them dominate at any point other than their 6-game win streak last year when they were outscoring their problems. So that game against the Washington Capitals was highly encouraging, because if what he's going to do is implement a system that benefits a bunch of undersized scoring forwards, benefit those guys' strengths rather than forcing them to play a style they've never played in their 1,300-point Hall of Fame career, Patrick Kane, I'm going to be very happy. Now, do I think they're going to make the playoffs? Probably not. They're 8 points out starting post-Christmas. It's a lot of games left, but it's a massive uphill battle to climb in a very competitive Eastern Conference. But what I'm looking for is, how will the youth respond? How will the culture in the locker room take a step forward? And can they finish strong? And the first sign of that, the game against the Washington Capitals, was very encouraging on that front.
Talk to me about Patrick Kane reaching another milestone on Sunday, and what does that mean to him and this team at this point?
Well, he's second all-time among American-born players. We had that discussion before we hopped on here. He's third all-time among Americans because Brett Hull's got that dual citizenship, but second among American-born players behind Mike Modano. 1,300, he had a goal and an assist, and the goal and assist was really pretty as well. I mean, the goal, you got to give it a lot of credit to Alex DeBrincat on that, because they have that connection going back to Chicago. He kind of had a running screen where he skated right across of Lindgren's face right as Kane was loading up to take the shot on the power play, and he was able to beat Lindgren. And then the assist, he got the puck behind the net. Cat swung in down low and tic-tac-toe. I mean, that pipeline those two players seem to have, it just works both ways so beautifully. And, I mean, Patrick Kane struggled a lot this season, and I think a lot of it has to do with, the message in the locker room getting stale, because they were playing good defense, but they weren't winning hockey games. And so eventually it all fell apart. Well, now the message is, okay, what are you good at? Let's play that style of hockey. Go out there and play effing hockey. You know what you're going to do. Patrick Kane in particular, you're an automatic Hall of Fame player. Go out there and do what made you an automatic Hall of Fame player. The team had energy. They had life, and more importantly, they had creativity and possession of the puck after game number 1. They only had, I think, 5 shots against after the first period, Gil, and that wasn't because they were playing great defense. It's because they had the puck. Yeah, if you're in the offensive zone, you're not going to give up a lot of shots against. Right. So, and a lot of that has to do with Patrick Kane. The top line, too. The top line was fantastic with Dylan Larkin, but Patrick Kane's creativity in the offensive zone when he is on is fantastic. So, I think that player we saw last year, coming back off that injury, signing with Detroit, I think that's what Patrick Kane is. But I think that a lot of the stagnation with him and the rest of the team had to do with the message in the locker room just getting stale.
Is there more pressure now on Steve Yzerman after making this coaching change? This is what, year 5 of the Yzer plan, or 6? And they still, we're not at the beginning of this plan and still haven't made the playoffs. So is there more pressure on Steve Yzerman? 6. Okay.
Yeah. I was trying to do them like in 2019 or 2019 draft was his first draft. So the 2020 season was his first year. 2020, 21, 22, 23, 24, and this will be the 25 season. So, yeah, 6th year.
Right.
So I was playing. Yeah, I think I said it after he got hired, McClellan, that is that the bullets are out of Yzerman's gun, and now it's facing him. No more heads are left to be rolled for him to use as a scapegoat because, the loan system got stale, but this roster is not perfect either. This is a roster that's wild card contender at best, which was the goal for Yzerman this year, was contend for a wild card. But, you fired your head coach, and that was your guy, your handpicked guy. We're 6 years into this. There's not much left you can use as an excuse to why this team has not succeeded other than your own choices. So, I mean, yes. Did you have a horrible hand dealt to you when you came back to Detroit? You had no prospects and a horrible cap situation, and you got screwed by the draft lottery. Absolutely. But 6 years later, Lucas Raymond's here. Moritz Seider's here. Simon Edmondson's here. All your top picks are now in the NHL, save Axel Sandin Pellikka, Nate Danielson, and Sebastian Kosa. Save those three guys who are more recent picks / goalies who take forever. They're not here yet. So at a certain point, it's like, okay, well, you've restocked the cabinet. Is your cabinet doing enough? And I think his amateur scouting has been superb. That has been something that's been working out. The free agent, the pro scouting is where it's very, very questionable. The Andrew Kopp signing has not aged well. The Sherratt signing's been, despite what people may say, has been okay. In all honesty, it's been okay. It's not been terrible. Comfer had a great first year. Has been awful this season. Trying to think who else. Gustafsson's been brutal this year. He let Gostisbehere walk. Of course, Gostisbehere might have been asking too much. David Perron was the heart and soul of the locker room. Let him walk. He traded away Jake Wallman. And you can't even say traded away for nothing. He actually gave up assets to offload him, and look what he's been doing with the Sharks. So, there's going to be a lot of criticism, and rightfully so, headed towards Steve Yzerman from this point going forward. Not that he's been awful. Again, his amateur scouting's been great. He's made some fantastic moves. Some of the trades he made early on paid dividends later down the line. So it's just like any general manager, Gil. It's a mixed bag. He's been pretty good overall, but now we're at a point where we're in the middle of the pack, and how he takes this team next is going to determine whether or not he's going to be the GM forever. Can he make the moves necessary to take this team and elevate them to a cup contender, or are they going to be a team like the Hurricanes were for a long time, or the Minnesota Wild still kind of are, and be just like a middle of the road team that can never truly take that step towards contender status? That's the make or break point of any rebuild. It's easy to suck. It's easy to sell off assets. Can you then take those assets you gained back and make that team a contender? And now that we're at the crossroads of that rebuild. So, after this season, this season's already kind of a wash, barring some miracle. But next season, the first full year under McClellan, if it doesn't go well, I think rightfully so, people are going to be asking a lot of questions.
Well, I know you'll have your finger on the pulse of this the rest of the way. Brian, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you and your co-host on social media?
You can find the podcast anywhere you listen to them. You can Google, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Odyssey app. I always plug that. I used to work for Odyssey, so a little plug for them. YouTube as well. We get most of our viewing traffic, Gil, actually comes via YouTube these days, which I don't understand why people would want to look at this, but they do. So you can check that out as well. I'm on Twitter at Brian Fisher, LORW, on Blue Sky as well. Same moniker. Scotty's on both as well at Bentley Scotty. And then LO_Red Wings is where we're at on social media for those two apps as well.
Brian, thank you so much.
No problem, Gil. I always appreciate you inviting me on to talk about my Red Wings, win or lose, but prefer win.
Thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen today. For your second listen, find Locked On Fantasy Hockey. Become a fantasy hockey expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from our hosts, Steele and Flip. Find Locked On Fantasy Hockey on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank my guests today, Hunter Hodies of Locked On Penguins, Harrison Lee of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, and Brian Fisher of Locked On Red Wings for joining me today. I'm Gil Martin. I host the Monday edition of Locked On NHL, and I co-host the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. Don't forget, we are here every day, Monday through Friday, and Saturday too now with our Women's Hockey Spotlight. We bring you the biggest stories from around the NHL and the world of hockey. Have a great day and a happy new year, everybody. Stay safe, and thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.